Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to never miss an update from RAU'S.
Hello and welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper analysis from the perspective of UPSC examination. Today we are going to take up Delhi edition of The Hindu newspaper dated 3rd of July 2020. The articles which we are going to cover today are displayed on the screen. Let's now begin the discussion.
We'll start today's discussion with a very important topic, that is the relationship between China and Hong Kong and the troubles which are being caused to Hong Kong because of this complicated and convoluted relationship. Now, the coverage of this issue is not only important from the perspective of international relation, but it is also important from the perspective of GS1 World History syllabus. And hence, it becomes important for us to understand the historical context, or rather, very particular historical context, which has given rise to all the complications which the Hong Kong is facing right now. So these two news articles appearing on page number 14, China opposes UK's citizenship offer and businesses back new security law, deal with the ramification of the same news. That is about the controversial legislation which the China has brought, which has granted mainland Chinese authorities unprecedented control over the city. Because of which Britain has almost decided to intervene in this matter and has also decided to extend citizenship to the residents of Hong Kong. So in this context, we'll first understand the historical context, that how it ended up with Britain and then finally it was ceded back to China, but with special mechanisms. And we'll also try to understand that what are the main issues or bones of contentions between China and Hong Kong, which is causing continuous ruckus in Hong Kong in last 3 to 4 years, because of which Hong Kong is not able to function properly and peacefully. Now, starting with prelims perspective, Hong Kong forms a part of Pearl River Delta, where the Pearl River flows into the South China Sea. So that is important aspect from the perspective of prelims examination. Now moving on to the relationship which Hong Kong shares with that of China. So when you look at the map of the China, you can easily see that Hong Kong belongs to the geographical region of China. But the question should arise that why China does not control the Hong Kong same way it controls Beijing and other cities of China. And the answer to that lies in the history. Because Hong Kong was once a part of China before 1842, but Hong Kong was acquired by Britain after defeating China in the Opium War. Now to give you a little bit of context, the war broke out after the Qing dynasty, which ruled China, attempted to crack down on illegal opium trade that led to widespread addiction in the Chinese. And hence, as a result of this crackdown over opium trade, there was a war between Britain and China. And finally, in 1842, China agreed to cede the island of Hong Kong to British in perpetuity through the Treaty of Nanjing. So this treaty was organized at Nanjing, where the defeated party, China, agreed to give away the island to the Britain. Then over the course of 50 years, United Kingdom gained control over all three main regions of Hong Kong. So it started with Hong Kong Island, then came the Kowloon Peninsula, and finally the new territories, which were a swath of land that comprises the bulk of Hong Kong today. So you can compare the scenario with that of India. Initially, the British had a very small territory in the coastal locations of our country, and from there they gradually started expanding their rule towards the inside of the mainland. And then finally in 1898, the Convention for the Extension of Hong Kong Territory was organized, where China agreed to lease all the new territories, which included the three regions as well as the island of Hong Kong, to Britain for the next 99 years. Which means if you calculate from 1898, that lease will end in 1997, and it did. And hence, before 1997, Britain decided to withdraw itself from Hong Kong. But it could not leave the citizens of the Hong Kong to the brutal Chinese system of governance. And hence they entered into an agreement according to which after the British will leave the Hong Kong territories, the Hong Kong will be ruled by a system which has come to be known as one country, two systems, in which the Hong Kong will revert back to Chinese sovereignty, which means that China will be able to legally show the areas and the regions of Hong Kong as its own part. But at the same time, Hong Kong will retain the political and economic system which it had followed since the British occupied this territory. So China was being governed through communist principles, but at the same time Hong Kong was following capitalist system. It was decided that Hong Kong will continue with the capital system of economy, and at the same time China will not interfere in the way of life of the people of Hong Kong. And China would preserve Hong Kong's judicial as well as legislative autonomy for the next 50 years, which will be over in 2047. So these were the promises made by China to UK. Now, what we are seeing is that even before the 20 years have expired, since China has gained so much of economic political control, especially in the Asian region, that it has now begun to assert itself, not only with respect to Hong Kong, but also with respect to Taiwan. You can see that it is not allowing its entry at any of the international forums. And hence, a lot of issues have emerged between Hong Kong and China. So first we will discuss the issues which have existed even before the 20 years from 1997, and then we will discuss the issues which have recently emerged due to actions of Chinese government. So you know that when two territories, even if they are adjacent to each other, if they are governed by different rules, they evolve different ways of life. And similarly in the case of Hong Kong, this difference of governance over a period of more than 150 years has given rise to cultural differences. For example, most of the people in Hong Kong speak Cantonese, whereas most of the mainland Chinese are Mandarin speakers. Also, since the people of Hong Kong were under the system of British laws, which provided them very good amount of freedom. Whereas, if you know the history of the Chinese communism, nationalism since 1949, you can see that how the freedom of speech and expression have been throttled in Chinese mainland. But at the same time, Hong Kong people were free to express themselves not only in matters of art and culture, but also in terms of political affairs. So a stark contrast between the ideology and thinking of the people of these two regions have developed in past, which has led to the reluctance of the people of Hong Kong to assimilate themselves with the mainland Chinese. But at the same time, mainland China has tried a lot to impose Mandarin and various other aspects of their own way of life over Hong Kong, which was fiercely opposed by people of Hong Kong. So these were the flashpoints which existed even before 1997. But as you have seen just now in the discussion, that China promised 50 years of no interference in matters of Hong Kong. But even before 2020 has ended, a lot of issues have emerged. For example, the matter of democracy in Hong Kong. So one of the major flashpoints between Hong Kong and China is the way they elect their leader or the person who is going to govern the Hong Kong, which is known as CEO or Chief Executive of Hong Kong. Now, Hong Kong's chief executive elections are held every 5 years. And under the city's electoral system, only members of a select election committee can vote for the post of CEO. So you can clearly see that there is no right of universal suffrage. Members of election committee, which are around 1200, elect the CEO. Now you might ask that this is something similar to what we do for Rajya Sabha or a system of electoral college for election of president in United States of America. But the difference between these two is that the election committee consists of interest groups. And majority of members of this election committee is formed by industrialists having big business interests in mainland China. Similarly, it consists of deputies which are then appointed by Chinese government, and it also has a membership of members of National People's Congress, which is the highest organ of the state power, or you can say it is the national legislature of China for what it is worth. So now you can understand that the person favorable to the mainland China and the policies of the Beijing will have a chance of getting elected at the post of chief executive of Hong Kong. And the people of Hong Kong, being exposed to the ideas of Britain, demand direct elections just like the way it happens in Britain and India and any other part of the world which practices democracy. So this is one matter. Then another matter is the Chinese efforts to gain greater and greater control over Hong Kong. For example, last year, Chinese government tried to enact a law in Hong Kong which would have enabled extradition of any Hong Kong citizen to mainland China for investigation, arrest and any other purpose. And similarly, the article because of which we are having this discussion is about the new security law which has been recently passed and approved in China. The provisions of which are extremely draconian. For example, Beijing is going to establish a new security office in Hong Kong. Now, so far, Beijing does not openly and legally operate such an office. Although intelligence agencies of China are active in Hong Kong, but now it has gained the power to legally establish such an office. Then it has defined new crimes. And the most important aspect of that is it has included the damage to public property under the definition of terrorism. Now, if you are reading newspaper continuously, you might have seen in last 1.5 years, a lot of people from Hong Kong were out on the streets protesting these developments. And those protests also led to considerable damage to public property. And now China has equipped itself with a very fierce law, and it becomes even more fierce because there are provisions that Chinese authorities will decide that whether some of the trials can be conducted behind the closed doors exactly the same way they do their own trials in the mainland China. And now it has introduced the similar provisions for the people of Hong Kong as well. And in response to this, in response to what China is doing to the people of Hong Kong, Britain has now decided to intervene and has offered all those people from Hong Kong citizenship who are willing to come over to United Kingdom. And as China has raised very strong objections to this offer of Britain, and has assured United Kingdom of guaranteed response if United Kingdom goes ahead with such a plan. And the next news talks about how the people of industry and private sector in Hong Kong are not creating any trouble to this new law because of two main reasons. Now, one of them is coronavirus, or COVID has already led to a sharp decline in economic activity. And then Hong Kong has been facing a lot of law and order interruptions over a period of 2 to 3 years, and hence no person doing business would want that, and hence especially the industry people have come to the terms of this new law. So this is as far as the issue of Hong Kong is concerned. Notes are available in the PDF. Let's now move on to the next news. The article course contraction appears on page number 6 in the form of editorial. Now, the monthly data on index of industrial production have been released. And as was expected, the output in 8 core industries have suffered an overall contraction for a third straight month in the month of May. Now, the observations made in this particular article is not that important because, first of all, this data come month on month basis, and hence UPSC is not going to ask you about the trends of a particular month. But what UPSC is going to ask, and what it has asked in the past, is about the basics of these indices. And that is what we are going to cover in this particular discussion. Since a lot of our viewers are new and they have just started the preparation, it is always a good idea to revisit the basic concepts, as these have been covered in past 6 to 9 months. So all those viewers who have watched these basic concepts may decide to skip this discussion. But in this session, we are going to talk about what index of industrial production is all about. What does it actually mean when we say an index or an item basket? Which is the body which releases it? How are various kinds of products categorized in IIP? Then we will understand the significance of IIP. And then finally we will talk about the 8 core industries and their individual contribution to the index of 8 core industries. So in 2015, UPSC had asked in the index of 8 core industries, which one of the following is given the highest weight? And the right answer is electricity generation has the highest weight in 8 core industries indices. We'll see how. Then in 2012, UPSC had asked in India, in the overall index of industrial production, the indices of 8 core industries have combined weight of 37.9%. Which of the following are among those 8 core industries? So there are 8 core industries. You are expected to recall each one of them. And if you start reading from the top, cement, fertilizer, natural gas and refinery products, all these 4 are included in the 8 core industries, whereas textile finds no place in that list. And hence the right answer will be C, 1, 2, 3 and 4 only. So you can see that direct questions come from index of 8 core industries as well as index of industrial production. And hence we will start by understanding the basics of the index. Now, index of industrial production or IIP is an index used to track the performance of industrial sector in the economy. So the first question which should arise is that what is an index? Now, an index is a composite number, an absolute number free of any units of measurement. So, for example, when you see indices like CPI or IIP or WPI, they don't have any number. They are usually expressed in terms of percentage with reference to a previous period. So, for example, an index in 2011 can be assigned a number of 100. And if that grows to 150 in 2020, we say that it has grown by 50%. So this index is used to track the performance of industrial sector. But the question arises that if we consider the industrial sector of our country, it is so vast, it is geographically so scattered, and most of it is in informal sector, how do we make sure that each and every economic activity of manufacturing, mining, production is taken into account and is measured? How do we make sure that? And now that is where the concept of item basket comes into play. Because it is generally not practicable to include all the economic activities that contribute to industrial production. Because data for some of the activities may not be readily and economically available, and even it might not be feasible to gather that data. And hence, the statisticians have taken the help of item basket, which means a representative basket of items selected by applying judgment and on the basis of their relative importance for inclusion in the compilation of the index. Don't worry, I will simplify it. So for example, these dots, if they represent all the industrial activities going on in our country, and we know that it is not possible to keep a track of all of them, what we will do is that we'll try to find out that which one among them contribute most to India's industrial production. And let's say after the survey, it has been found that the red dots are the ones which are most prominent. And it was found out that other industrial production were somewhat related to these red ones. So if red ones were found to have increased production, the blue ones also had increased production, and also the vice versa. Since we have to collect the data on industrial activity every month, it would make our lives very easy if we just map these red industrial activity and apply the same to all other. So this selection of industrial activity for calculation of index is known as item basket. So you should keep one thing in mind, that whenever you see index written on something, you should know that it is not tracking everything. So for example, if there is CPI written somewhere, which means it is a price index, which doesn't mean that it is tracking the price of each and every object in our country. It is just keeping a track of a basket of objects, and it is assuming that if these items in the basket are showing inflation, rest other will show inflation as well, just like index of industrial production. Now once these objects are chosen to keep track of, they are assigned relative weights. For example, few of the activities dominate over others, and hence we need to assign greater importance to their data. So we'll not go into the details of how that is done, because that will take us into the domain of statistics. But it is important from the perspective of prelims examination to understand how the indices system work. So let's say we are tracking coal sector. So obviously if the production of the coal sector is increasing, that means that demand of coal is also increasing, which is a very, very positive indicator of economic and industrial growth. So let's say in 2011, we had a production of X metric ton for the whole month, and we allocated that to an amount of 100. Then in 2020, due to coronavirus impact, we are producing X by 2 metric ton of coal, which means that our production has gone down by 50%. And hence, if the index was 100, the current index would be 50. And similarly, if it had increased to 150, the production would be 1.5x. So this is how a calculation is done to calculate the index every month by an organization known by the name of Central Statistical Office, or CSO. Now for the calculation of basket, the products in the economy, especially the industrial products, are divided into various kinds of groups. But as we know that there are various ways of dividing them into groups as well. For example, one of them is sectoral classification, where the industrial production for the purpose of IIP is divided into 3 sectors: manufacturing, mining and electricity. And highest weightage in this category is given to manufacturing sector. Then there is another classification as well, which is use-based classification. The definition to each one of them can be found in the PDF of the DNS discussion today. But just to give you a brief idea, primary goods are such goods which are directly obtained from natural sources and used for the purpose of further processing and consumption. For example, ores, minerals and electricity. Similarly, capital goods are those goods which enhance the production capacity, for example, investment in plants and machineries, boilers, gas compressors, engines, etc. Then we have infrastructure or construction goods. Then we have consumer durables and consumer non-durables. So as the name suggests, consumer durables would be those which have a long lifetime. For example, pressure cooker, air conditioners, tiles. And non-durables would be typically those consumption items like oil, toned and skimmed milk, which will have a very small shelf life and which can't be preserved for a long time. So this is it as far as the index basics is concerned. But the question arises that what is the significance of IIP? Now first and foremost is that IIP provides a single representative figure to measure the general level of industrial activity in the country, and that too on the monthly basis. Now it is not difficult to think that comparison of economic performance over time is a key factor in economic analysis. And it is also a fundamental requirement for policy making. And hence, important decision making bodies of our country, for example, Finance Ministry and Reserve Bank of India, both rely heavily on data of IIP. Not just the government, but also the private sector, especially the analyst community, as well as private companies seeking investment, they anxiously wait for IIP data to make their important investment decisions. Apart from that, compilation of gross value added of the manufacturing sector is done on the basis of data of IIP. And also, IIP is used for the projection of advanced estimates of GDP for the next year, which is again very important for making projections and future forecast of revenues of the government. Now we move on to the 8 core industries. And as you have seen in the question, yes, it is important to memorize all of them, which are coal, crude oil, natural gas, refinery products, fertilizers, steel, cement and electricity. And it is also important to keep in mind their individual weights. And if you see, the highest weightage is given to refinery products. But the question of the past year which we solved had the right answer of electricity because the refinery products was not there in the option. So it is important to memorize these order in order to be able to walk into the examination hall confidently. So the facts are DIPP releases the data, whereas the data for IIP is released by CSO, and the name of these sectors as well as their contributions. Now the article India loses jurisdiction over Italian Marines case appears on front page, and rightly so. Now the government of India has said that it is still studying international tribunal's ruling that Italian Marines accused of killing 2 fishermen in the waters off the coast of Kerala in 2012 held immunity and would face a trial in Italy, not in India. Now this is a very important and a serious matter. And to understand the technicalities and legalities of this particular case, you will have to first understand the provisions of the UNCLOS, which become important from the perspective of both prelims as well as mains examination. Because United Nations Convention for the Law of the Sea is that framework which governs the overall jurisdiction of the countries into the areas of water surrounding them. So all those people who are not aware of this particular case, this famous case is known as Enrica Lexi case, which is an ongoing international controversy about shooting off the coast of India in 2012 when 2 Indian fishermen were killed in Kerala by these 2 Italian Marines, who were then aboard Italian flagged commercial oil tanker MV Enrica Lexi. Now shortly after the incident, the Indian Navy intercepted the MV Enrica Lexi and detained these 2 Italian Marines. Now that arrest of these 2 Italian Navy Marines has sparked a conflict of opinions over legal jurisdiction and functional immunity between Government of India and Italy, and has continued to cause diplomatic tension between these 2 nations. And the whole dispute is about where the ship was located with respect to the coast of India. So this is just a representation of a typical coast, and during all the period, Italian authorities have maintained that India lacked jurisdiction in judging the case, since the location of the Enrica Lexi was outside the territorial waters of India, which means that it was beyond this limit towards the sea, and hence India will have no authority over such an arrest. And hence it becomes important for us to understand that how does it matter where the ship was located with respect to Indian coastline. But before that, United Nations Convention for the Law of the Sea, which is acronymed as UNCLOS or UNCLOS. Now, Law of the Sea Convention is that framework which defines the rights and responsibility of the nations with respect to the use of world oceans and the coastlines. And we'll shortly understand how. But first, let us understand that what was the scenario when there was no such global treaty to govern the oceans. And that was freedom of the seas, which was a concept developed in 16th and 17th century, where the national rights were limited to a specified belt of water extending from nation's coastline. So if this is a coastline and this is the land and this is the ocean, then usually the 3 nautical miles region from the coastal area shall be considered as the area in the complete jurisdiction of this country. And although this is laughable, but this 3 nautical miles was usually determined by the cannon shot rule, which was the extent to which a nation could control its coastal waters, was largely based on the reach of its cannons which were placed on the shore. So that was 16th and 17th century. So you can see that there was no global framework on how the nations will control the waters beyond these 3 nautical miles. And as the technology in navigation developed and industrialization and increasing commerce led to over-exploitation of marine resources, a need was felt to evolve a very sophisticated mechanism to govern the oceans, and hence came the UNCLOS. Although it is a very extensive convention, but we are going to just consider the part which is relevant for us, and that is the division of the oceans through which the jurisdiction of the nations decline gradually, and we'll understand how. So first, at the outset, you will see a lot of nautical miles written all across, because these are the parameters through which these boundaries are drawn, which you can see with the shaded blue color. Now these miles are nautical miles which are based on the circumference of the earth, which equals to 1 minute of latitude, and it comes out to be around 1.85 kilometers, which is marginally larger than the land mile. So first and foremost, a baseline is drawn for each and every country, and it is the low water line along the coast as officially recognized by the coastal state. So in this example, you can see that this is the baseline. So all the water bodies which lie towards the landward side of the baseline and over which the country commands full sovereignty, and there is no right of innocent passage to anyone. Now what is this right of innocent passage? Now it is a concept in the law of the seas that allows for a vessel to pass through territorial waters of another state subject to certain restrictions. So for example, a ship is coming from the high seas towards the Indian borders. Now this track is known as passage, and passage is innocent as long as ship refrains from engaging in certain prohibited activities, including weapons testing, spying, smuggling, or any kind of scientific research which has been declared by this country as prohibited. And hence any foreign vessel entering into inland areas will have to take the permission of India, and they will not have a right of innocent passage. So they can't claim that they have entered and they will not do any harm. So for entry into internal waters, they will have to take the permission of the coast guards. Then after the internal waters comes the territorial waters. The territorial sea extends seaward up to 12 nautical miles from the baseline. So as you can see, this is the baseline, and 12 nautical mile region from the baseline is territorial sea or territorial waters. Now as far as the jurisdiction of this particular country is concerned, it has full sovereignty both on the seabed and the sea surface, as well as it commands complete control over the airspace as well. And for the foreign vessels, they have the right of innocent passage. So for example, if they are not carrying any arms, or if they are not a military warship, they can enter into these regions, and once caught, they can claim that they were entering innocently and they be allowed to return back. And this is exactly what India claims, is that Italian marines with full-fledged arms killed Indian fishermen from Kerala into Indian territorial waters. And since India has full sovereignty, which means that these areas will be treated just like some land area in Kerala, and hence the laws of India shall be applicable to the activities which occur here as well. And since a murder has taken place, India will proceed according to its own laws. And on the contrary, Italy claims that the murder did not take place in the territorial waters, but rather it took place much beyond the territorial waters. Now after the territorial waters region ends, starts a contiguous zone, which is again of 12 nautical miles. It is basically an intermediary zone between the territorial sea and the high seas. Now, the coastal state has the right to both prevent as well as punish infringement of many kinds of laws, for example, custom law, sanitary law, immigration laws. So, for example, Indian patrol vessels and Indian coast guards can intercept a ship in this region and try to find out who are the people who are leaving the country or entering the country. One important aspect to remember, however, is that in case of territorial water, the coastal country had full sovereignty over seabed as well as airspace. But in this case, in contiguous zone, the contiguous zone only provides for the jurisdiction of ocean floor and surface and not the airspace. So this is an important distinction which you should keep in mind. And finally comes the exclusive economic zone or EEZ, which stretches up to 200 nautical miles from the coastline. And within the exclusive economic zone, a coastal state has sovereign rights for the purpose of exhaustion of natural resources, for example, exploration, exploitation, as well as conservation and management of natural resources as well. And at the same time, it also has the rights to carry out activities for production of energy from water and wind. So EEZ mainly concerns with the economic aspect of sovereignty. India wants to put windmills over these regions. It has full freedom to do that. So unlike the territorial sea and contiguous zone, the EEZ only allows for the above mentioned resource rights. As we discussed, just limited to the economic aspect. It does not give a coastal state the right to prohibit or limit freedom of navigation or overflight. And another important distinction exists, which is international waters, which are the waters outside the territorial areas. So with respect to prelims examination, especially this discussion is very important, because a very simple and basic question can be asked with respect to these limits in terms of distance, also in terms of order, an important distinction between jurisdiction of coastal state as far as territorial waters and EEZ is concerned. So keep these things in mind. Now, the Ministry of Railways recently invited request for qualification for operation of passenger trains by private operators in PPP mode, that is public-private partnership mode, on 109 routes with 150 modern trains. Now, such a move by ministry comes after the successful launch of India's first corporate train, that is Tejas Express, which is right now operating between Lucknow and Delhi and Ahmedabad-Mumbai routes. Now, these two moves by government are considered to be quite significant and will go a long way in ending Indian Railways' monopoly in running trains in India. So in this regard, first we will understand what the PPP model is and how it solves the problems faced by current stakeholders. And then finally we will understand other issues which Indian Railways is facing, and this privatization might not solve them, with the help of an answer to the mains question. Now, as far as the present status of Indian Railways is concerned, the Finance Minister had recently stated that Indian Railway is going to need an investment of around 50 lakh crore between 2018 and 2030, which means within a period of 12 years, it is going to need an investment of 50,000 crore, which comes out to be more than 4 lakh crore per annum. However, as we all know, the financial status of Indian Railways is quite poor, which is evident in the fact that operating ratio has increased to around 98.4 in 2018 and 19. Now, operating ratio is companies' operating expenses as a percentage of revenue. So if revenue of railway is 100, then it is spending around 99 of that. So that is a big problem. Now you have to understand the vicious cycle for Indian Railways to understand why it always plagues with a lot of issues. Now, Indian Railways is a departmental undertaking which is directly under the control and management of the government. And hence, as a commercial undertaking, the Indian Railway does not enjoy the kind of autonomy it should have. And hence, the political interference is very obvious in the functioning of the Indian Railways, which leads to lower passenger fares and higher freight charges, which is known as cross-subsidization. Most governments are reluctant to raise the prices of the passenger fares because then it will directly impact the votes. But governments regularly increase freight charges, massively hurts our industrial production as well as transport. And this cross-subsidization leads to higher operating ratio, as we saw, because we are not increasing the passenger fares. And this higher freight charges leads a lot of people to shift to other modes of transports, mainly trucks on highways, which then leads to less revenue for Indian Railways and hence low investment in new capacity addition, which then ultimately results in poor maintenance and lack of world-class amenities for poor passengers, which then results in lack of world-class amenities for passengers, and then this cycle continues. So as an alternative to this model, the Indian Railway has decided to run few private trains. Now the first trait of this model is the sharing of resources. Under this model, the physical infrastructure such as railway tracks, signaling, railway stations, etc. would remain under the control of Indian Railways, and the private sector entities would be required to bring in their modern coaches to operate on specific routes. And the second important aspect is that of payment mechanism, where the private sector is required to pay charges to railways for its use of its physical infrastructure such as railway tracks, signaling, railway stations, etc. Apart from that, private sector operator needs to share the revenue with the Indian Railways as well. So now you can see where we are going. It tries to break two kinds of nodes in this vicious cycle. So let us now analyze the benefit of this mechanism to various stakeholders. So if we analyze the stakeholders, there are three such stakeholders in this particular equation. The first is Indian Railways, then is the private contractor, and then finally the passengers. Now let us start with the passengers. It will obviously benefit them because it will enhance the choices available to the passengers. At the same time, private sector operators would be forced to attract passengers and hence they would compete with each other to provide better and better facilities. And also private sector participation would expand the passenger capacity and hence benefit passengers. Now as far as Indian Railway is concerned, these private trains shall be free from political interference in fixing the passenger fares. And since one of the share will come to Indian Railways as well, so it can be assured of increase in revenues. Then of course the operating cost will be reduced because all the operations of these trains shall be taken care by the private sector. But their revenue shall come to the Indian Railways. And higher revenue means higher income, which will then reduce Indian Railways' reliance on borrowed funds. As far as private sector is concerned, they will have the advantage of complete independence and autonomy to decide fares of such trains. As recently stated by Indian Railways, IRCTC is earning 5 lakh rupees on each trip Tejas Express is making, and hence more such train means more profit for the private sector on the same available capital assets. And if this experiment is successful, it will pave the way for higher private sector participation in Indian Railways. And now is the time for this mains question, which says privatization of Indian Railways, although a step in right direction, is not a panacea. Discuss in 15 marks and 250 words. And the first step towards answering a question is about identification of the parts and keywords. So one of the keyword you can directly see is discuss, and another keyword is panacea. So it says that privatization of Indian Railways, although a step in right direction, is not a panacea. So in your answer, you have to first substantiate the fact that privatization of Indian Railway is indeed a step in right direction, but it does not solve all the problem, and that has to be demonstrated. So any approach towards mains answer should start with introduction. And there can be various styles of writing introduction. It could be about data. It could also be about any recent event. It could also be definition. So in this particular example, either we can start by defining what privatization of Indian Railways mean, or we can also start by saying that recently Government of India has taken a decision, or Indian Railways has taken decision to increase the participation of private sector in management of Indian Railways. So that depends upon the personal choice. But one thing should be important is that introduction should be relevant, and it should lay the grounds for the body part. Then moving to the body part, and the heading of the body part can take inspiration directly from the question by saying that benefits of privatization of Indian Railways. And you can directly mention the points which we have discussed either in the form of a flowchart or in the form of paragraph, whatever it may be. But as soon as you finish this paragraph, you have to say, but the long-term issues like lack of independent regulator in the railway sector, restructuring of railway zones, infrastructural upgradation. For example, if these mechanisms are successful, they will not automatically lead to the upgradation of railway tracks to the modern one. Indian Railways will have to make conscious efforts toward that. Then you can end it, and you must end with a conclusion. And finally, you can say that privatization of Indian Railways, although a step in the right direction, requires a lot of other steps to be taken as recommended by Vivek Debroy committee, which should be followed by the government. Let us now move on to the next news. Now this particular article appears on page number 11. Bid to turn Shivalik forest into tiger reserve. Now from the perspective of environment section of the prelims, it is important to understand how sanctuaries, national parks, conservation reserve, community reserves and tiger reserves are declared. All these provisions are governed by Wildlife Protection Act 1972, which is a mother law for most of the protected areas in our country. And as far as the wildlife sanctuaries are concerned, they are declared by the state government. Just a notification of state government is sufficient to constitute an area as wildlife sanctuaries, and that's why we have thousands of wildlife sanctuaries in our country. Now as far as the permission for declaration of such an area as a wildlife sanctuary is concerned, the state government will have to take the permission of the center if and only if any part of that sanctuary is a part of territorial water. Otherwise, it shall not have to take the permission. And as far as the governance of wildlife sanctuaries are concerned, we know that they are governed by the officers of Indian Forest Service, and in this case, the rank will be Chief Wildlife Warden, who shall be the authority who shall control, manage and maintain all sanctuaries. Similarly, national parks are also declared by state government. And an important aspect to remember is that such a declaration can be on the basis of unique ecological, faunal, which means animal, floral, which means plant-based, even geomorphological or zoological association or importance for the purpose of protecting these associations. So for example, if there is a kind of a unique rock in an area, then also state government can declare a national park over there. It is not necessary for national park declaration that should protect a plant or an animal. It can also be a geomorphological or geological association, sir. Now all the details can be read in the PDF. I am just highlighting the important aspects, and that is the involvement of National Board for Wildlife. Now you have to remember one thing, that declaration is unilateral by the state government. But once a state government has declared an area or a territory as national park, any further alteration or removal or the change of any kind shall have to be approved by National Board for Wildlife. And you know that National Board for Wildlife is constituted by central government, and it is very high powered committee because it is chaired by Prime Minister. And then finally we have Tiger Reserve. Now in this case, the state government shall notify the creation of Tiger Reserve, but that shall be on the recommendation of National Tiger Conservation Authority or NTCA. And again, no state shall denotify a tiger reserve except in public interest and the approval of Tiger Conservation Authority as well as National Board for Wildlife. So for notification, it needs the permission of National Tiger Conservation Authority as well as for denotification. We have not discussed conservation reserve as well as community reserve. You can read in the PDF the details about them, but they are not that important as compared to national park and tiger reserves. Now it's time for us to take up the summary from the perspective of prelims examination. From the discussion on index of industrial production, it is important to keep in mind that it is a monthly data released by CSO. What is the meaning of the basket? What are the two kinds of classification as far as sectoral and use-based classification is concerned? Keep in mind 8 core industries, their weightages. Then in the discussion on UNCLOS or UNCLOS or Law of the Sea Convention, it is important to keep into mind these categories, the regions and extent to which they extend from the coastline, as well as the changes in the sovereignty and the applicability of the rights of states as well as the ships. With respect to Hong Kong, it is important to keep in mind situated on the Pearl Delta, and it came under the sovereignty of China in 1997. And then finally, the provisions of the Wildlife Protection Act with respect to the declaration and denotification of sanctuaries, national parks, and tiger reserve are important to memorize and do them. It's time for us to take up the question of the day. Now, question of the day for 2nd of July 2020 was, which of the following statements are correct about Sundarbans? Statement 1, it is the largest single block of tidal mangroves in the world. Which is correct, as Sundarbans are indeed the single largest block of tidal halophytic mangroves of the world. And the second statement is also correct because saltwater crocodiles are indeed found in the region of Sundarbans, which leads us to the right answer, both 1 and 2. And question of the day for today, that is 3rd of July 2020, is, consider the following statements. Statement 1, notification for creation of wildlife sanctuaries is issued by states, and national parks are created to protect plant and animals only. Which of the above statements are correct? A, 1 only, B, 2 only, C, both 1 and 2, D, neither 1 nor 2. Stay home, stay safe. It is time to show patience. Take care.